Hello, this is History You Never Heard, Part 1. The following presentation has been collected together to fill in the gaps concerning what actually transpired in recent history. In a work of this nature, it's virtually impossible to list the many references and sources for our material without wasting too much precious viewing time. So, most documentation is easily available for persons who will make a little commitment toward truth. Well, few governments or leaders have ever been objective or allowed true history placed on the records. And what you see here is a mixture of official war films, propaganda, and unofficial counter-observations. And the truth you'll need to sort out for yourself. This material can be duplicated and distributed in the interest of educating your fellow human beings, too. Freedom comes through knowledge and action. You can either view this and do nothing or act to further this knowledge. Well, to pinpoint the bad guys and the so-called good guys over the past is very difficult unless you just ignore what's written and go strictly on action. And this test is usually very revealing because the favorite roles are often reversed under this criteria or test. Today, for example, we never let up on the terrible Hitler. We constantly play diplomatic games with the communists, even though then we can easily see that more than 150 million persons have been recently murdered in the name of communism. China's Mao admitted to killing 63 million Chinese peasants alone, and yet today our leaders eagerly embrace new relationships with the same old brutal systems. At the end of World War II, the Red Cross reported that around 271,000 persons had died in German work camps from disease and old age and executions. Now, this was nowhere near the 7 million claimed by the communist Jews in New York City a little later. True, there was a terrible death rate, but even Germans were dying from malnutrition toward the ends of the war. And after their food supplies were cut off by Allied bombings, war shortages in general. And here we see many of the troop trains were diverted to carrying the prisoners and workers to the work camps. Records indicate that the Allies did not bomb Auschwitz because they wanted the advanced synthetic rubber plant intact later. Many witnesses and records at the time confirmed there were none of the gas chambers that later were supposed to claim 10,000 gassings. Later historians tracked down the truth. They found that the 6 million figure was false and dreamed up by organized groups interested in gaining worldwide sympathy. What did occur at this time in history was a number of little-known episodes that put the Jewish Holocaust concept to shame. In the Allied raid against the disarmed open city of Dresden, there were hundreds of thousands of civilians that died just before the war ended. Now, high-level military men are still ashamed of this unprecedented act. Well, later, we, the British and Americans, turned all of the Polish and other resistance fighters back to Russia to be slaughtered and sent to Soviet prison camps. And here you see just a few of these camps. These are the gulags, where millions of workers and political dissidents, men, women, and children, have been executed without trial, and enslaved in work battalions, starved and beaten. And the only crime is usually their religious, social, or political beliefs, their desire for individual and national freedom. These places mark the graveyards of millions of souls who dared to defy the system which now enslaves hundreds of millions of people. and who our press very seldom mentions. And here's another example of injustice that our press never covered. Chicago, Monday, February 25th, 1935, Chicago American, which was a small independent newspaper in America, covered this story, and it was the only one that historians feel ever covered it. 6 million perished in Russia. The Ukrainians died from a Soviet-planned famine, and this came about because the Ukrainian farmers put up massive resistance to Soviet plans to seize their land and turn it all into cooperatives. All the food found was taken, and by the 1930s, tens of thousands were dying weekly. And the rest of Russia had plenty of food, and these photos were smuggled out of Russia by a Chicago reporter, Thomas Walker. And to this day, no media broadcast has ever told this shocking story of the true Holocaust of the century. Now, this famine was among the worst recorded in history. The Encyclopedia Britannica in '68 claimed that it took the lives of 7 million Ukrainians, but it's scarcely acknowledged today in the West. Moscow never even officially admitted this famine ever existed. It was the result of Moscow's national and socio-economic Ukrainians in particular. And here's a map of the USSR concentration camps and psychiatric prisons today in 1985. And the press very seldom ever mentions it. Anything about it. Roosevelt was very aware that the war would bring prosperity to the U.S., and he cooperated in every way with the European elite, or the internationalists, the bankers. And the West could have invaded Germany in 1942, but Churchill kept stalling for 2 years to ensure that the industrialists had greater profits. By 1943, the Germans' generals knew that the war was lost, and they made repeated efforts to end the war on any honorable terms that they could. Now, they promised to keep the Soviets out of the Western Europe, and all of their efforts were perverted, discounted, and ignored. And Hitler had been right in claiming that the West wanted the Soviets in power in the total destruction of his Germany. National Socialism was not the issue at all, regardless of press. Billions of dollars poured into financing the Allied armies and rebuilding Europe after the war. And the profit went into the coffers of the elite internationalists, was financed by taxpayers of the West. And facing sure death at the hands of Soviets or giving a story to the British about what they wanted to hear, the most of the Germans chose the latter. The generals told how evil Hitler and the Germans were bad and how brilliantly the Allies had fought, and only British translators were used in the Nuremberg trials. And if the story didn't fit what they wanted to hear, it never got in the books. And the Germans said that Italians and Negro troops were just worthless. And what they said was Eisenhower's abilities were mediocre, and the Soviet moral brutes and the British bumblers, and the only man that they had anything good to say about was Patton. And they said he was great. And of course, none of this ever got in print. These are interviews, the Nuremberg trial. The interviewers, who later wanted the record set straight, were often sick of the twisting of the facts by the Allied commanders at the time. And German officers that wouldn't cooperate and stretch the truth as they wished were often just turned over to the Russians, and they were never heard from again. And this was quite an incentive to get the story they wanted out of the German staff. Some half a dozen German attempts to surrender have been pieced together by truth gatherers over the years. And one example was Pennsylvania's Governor George Earle, who was in the war under FDR as an attaché. And he was contacted by German officers and tried many times to get instructions on what to do from there on from FDR. And for his persistence, he got sent to a remote South Pacific in total silence from FDR. This is old Blood and Guts. Several months before his death, Patton's compromising stand on the denazification of the Bavarian Zone, which his troops occupied, cost him the commandership of the Third Army. Well, he was put into a paper army. He was known as the toughest as well as one of the most profane officers in the American forces. He maintained strictest discipline, and the Germans thought he was the most brilliant strategist and general that we had. He was a good strategist and a patriotic soldier. He realized that if he held Prague, he would hold the key to European defense. And just before he arrived in Prague, the shocked Roosevelt and staff manipulators told him to stop at once and hand over this territory to the Russians. Well, the Czechs in Prague pleaded. They wanted the West to let Patton liberate them. But evidently the powers influencing the war's policy wanted the Russians to gain control of this area. Patton was not happy about these and later events at all. And then a mysterious car crash later ended his life, and the events surrounding this accident, so-called, and the death certificate's validity are still questionable. Well, Patton ran wild when he finally landed in Europe. He quickly bottled up several 100,000 German troops. And is this why they firebombed Dresden, Germany, and killed millions of innocent civilian Christians, and allowed the communists to gobble up much of Europe? Well, we shall never know. We do know that both the Communist Revolution and Hitler's Nazis were financed and aided by various American English bankers who backed Roosevelt and Churchill later when Hitler wouldn't cooperate and couldn't be kept in control. Well, unlike the villain Hitler, Franklin Roosevelt did not follow through on his political promises. Hitler gave Germany prosperity, and he gave it back to the Germans just as he'd promised, and Roosevelt told us he'd drive the money changers from the temple, and he'd keep our boys out of any more wars, and reduce bureaucracy. And on every count, he did just the opposite of what he promised. Well, the bankers manipulated several panics to pave the way for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and Roosevelt completed this destruction of our dollar when he confiscated the gold backing and gave it to the private Federal Reserve bankers without so much as a receipt. Now, Henry Morgenthau was the Secretary of the Treasury during FDR's terms. In September of 1944, he outlined a plan to totally destroy Germany, make virtual slaves of her war survivors. Well, because of Morgenthau, for 3 years, hundreds of thousands of Germans were used as slave laborers in England, France, and many Western European countries. And it wasn't until Harry Truman came along and freed them that they were let go and returned to Germany. And this is something you'll never hear. And Churchill also wanted blood, and he wanted to use deadly anthrax gas in one situation against Germany, and he would have murdered millions of civilians if he'd had his way, according to the Lundy Sunday Times investigation at the time. He and Roosevelt did manage to exterminate hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in their infamous fire bombings. When surrender was only weeks away, the firebombing of Dresden in 1945 mutilated and killed 250,000 civilians for no other apparent reason than by Russian standards, very early. Fortune magazine brought out this fact in the 80s. Many non-Khazar Jews are encouraged to leave Russia and are politically unpopular. And Solzhenitsyn, the Russian expose writer, mentions that Jews who run the Russian prison camps and are not among the inmates. Today, at least 80% of the Russian leaders are Jews, and this is easy to document. It's only the Khazar Jews that have pushed for world domination and have been caught up in the ruthless dominion tactics, though. Where the genetic lineage came from is another and longer tale. The Soviets have long had more patience than most Westerners, and have spent years slowly gobbling up the world by patient craftiness and double-dealing. Peaceful coexistence, to them, simply means that they can keep on conquering country after country by internal revolution and subversion without the international large-scale wars that they saw before. The Afghans in Central America youths, for example, are sent to Cuba or Russia for indoctrination and are later let loose on their own people to bring on communism from within. Well, as the Allies came to the various work camps at the end of the war, what they found was pretty appalling to them. They'd not suffered food shortages nor been fed inadequate rations for months. The anthrax and typhus epidemics had killed thousands in some camps. This brought on the Holocaust charges. And to substantiate these charges from eyewitnesses was difficult at the time, since few prisoners would substantiate this idea of a purposeful starvation and cruelty. And a couple of Americans who we'll see here were in these camps and are explaining here how the rations were very skimpy, but they were hardly starved and tortured.
In 2 hours, we received very little food. 2 bowls of very watery soup and a small bread ration a day. Some of the men were not able to do this type of work on the food they were receiving, and upon not being able to, they were hit with rifle butts by the guard. I myself, at one time, because I was not able to do the work, was hit with a brick thrown by one of the guards. We were also promised to get paid and to receive cigarette rations from the Germans. I saw none of this while I was a prisoner of war in Germany.
My name is Charles J. Short. I'm from Akron, Ohio. I was captured in the Battle of the Bulge, December 19th, 1944. After making us walk for about 40 miles, I believe our worst experience was being packed on a small boxcar, 60 men to one car. During this time, we had received absolutely nothing to eat. After we had gotten on the boxcar, we received about this amount of bread, a 1 day's ration. Occasionally, we got a bucket of water to drink. We were never allowed off of the cars for the 8 days and 8 nights that we were on. After we arrived at our working commando, things were not quite so bad, but we were always hungry. For the whole 5 months, we never did have enough to eat. In 2 months' time after being captured, I myself lost 55 pounds. I lost 4 inches off my waist.
According to writers of this era, there was seldom over 20,000 political prisoners into the whole of Germany between 1934 and 1938. Fewer than 3,000 of these subversives were communists and radicals, and 3,000 Jews at the most. As the war broke out, Zionist leaders openly declared war on Germany and sided with the Western democracies. Himmler then did the same thing the U.S. did against the Japanese. He started rounding them up, especially after thousands had conducted partisan warfare against the Germans. Now, immigration was favored, and hundreds of thousands immigrated during this period. This left around 3 million Jews in all of Europe, and a number of documents and articles of the period confirm this figure. Now, 90% of European quota visas were filled shortly after the war, and Jews flooded into the United States. And toward the end of the war, of course, thousands entered Palestine illegally on boats. It just so happens a friend of mine was instrumental in finding the first boat for these Palestine refugees. He stated to me that the black market was run by ethical Jews who rounded up the unethical Jews of Europe and wanted them shipped out. So the Jews that were on the first boat were unethical and not even accepted by their own people in Europe at the time. This is not meant to be a work deriding or against Jews. It's simply meant to be an honest production that calls a spade a spade. Well, what you're seeing here is pictures of Buchenwald. And this is what happened after a typhus epidemic caused widespread sickness in many of the camps after supplies were cut off through Allied bombing. Starvation occurred. Even the Germans were starving. And it's unfortunate that all of this happened. But we have to look also at the other side, which we've never heard. Hitler was financed after he agreed to encourage industry and certain firms in producing war machinery. And as he grew more independent, the bankers overseas cut off his loans. But he circumvented this and a boycott to a large degree through trading and swapping with his suppliers. And he functioned this way without the use of money to a large degree. And after escaping the bankers' control, they quickly moved against him and financed his opponents. Now, the prison camp extermination scenario is well-rooted and true in part, but it is not even part of the whole picture. Now, it would have been illogical to assume that the Germans wished to purposely starve the inmates in the many war production plants across Germany, and that's what these stalags and camps were. They were war production plants. They were desperate in Germany for new war materials, and the strategies and so-called concentration camps supplied the workers, and it kept production up and flowing. And the stalags were important, and only when supplies got cut off did the starvation spread. Many camp personnel were actually executed during this period for barbaric action against prisoners by their officers. Now, this is according to the records. It's not what you ever hear. Now, there have been a number of authors who've researched the Hitler atrocities during World War II and have concluded that the Holocaust concepts were distorted. Rasner was a French inmate in the camps whose book concluded that there simply wasn't any great anti-Jewish sentiment at all. And the Institute of Historical Review sold several publications that showed lack of food and disease were the great enemies during this period. And most objective authors concluded that the gas ovens were enlarged later to aid Jewish sympathy. And even free Germans had little to eat by the end of the war, according to persons that were on the scene. Now, little wonder that prisoners and factory workers got starvation rations. Now, the Institute of Historical Review offered $50,000 reward in the 1980s for proof of the crematorium ovens. If someone offered proof, they'd pay up. Now, shortly after this office was blown up and burned to the ground. And Professor Otto Frank's book of 1980 used an acre of newspaper, a record space, concluded that the ovens were used to cremate typhoid and natural death victims, and greatly enlarged as tourist traps and promotion gimmicks later. He said it was impossible to have even half the Jews of the popular 6 million figure to have even existed at this period. So in view of the 75 billion in German marks that have been paid to Israel already, and the 30 or so billion Americans have chipped in, it's obvious sympathy may have motivated all this exaggeration. And today, more Jewish survivors collect pensions from Germany than were recorded as inmates in all of Hitler's camps. From the propaganda of the media and Allied information machine, all Germans were behind Hitler and his goals. Germany loved him. Records of the time, though, indicate that many Germans risked death to expose injustice and do away with Hitler. And toward the end of the war, even Hitler's most trusted command leaders sometimes tried to end the war without further bloodshed. Now, Himmler and Kaltenbrunner attempted to contact Allied officials and wanted to do away with Nazi warmongers in the party. And they set up meetings with Swiss and other European persons of influence to help bring about a peaceful surrender. And they sent an emissary, General Wolfe, who finally got word to American leaders and helped set up a surrender meeting at Caserta in April 28, 1945. General Morgan represented the Allies and insisted on unconditional surrender. And the Germans, represented by SS Wenner, were agreeable on any terms. And the surrender was set up for May 2nd. Well, after the top army leaders opposed the SS leaders' actions, there was wrangling, but in a few days the unanimous decisions to surrender were made, and Italian Germans began to surrender. Now, unfortunately, the signed surrender never reached the Allied leaders in Germany. But in a few days, the majority of German commanders surrendered anyway. The international bankers, the Soviets, were opposed to this early surrender. And there were several earlier surrender attempts that were foiled by not only the Allies, but German generals in particular. Now, the Russians were opposed, and it would allow American troops to occupy Trieste first, and they would lose any right to claim the area. They later gobbled up eastern Germany because of this delay. And this delay cost millions of lives in Allied bombings and hundreds of thousands of soldiers' lives. You can ask any soldier there what happened at Dresden, a non-military target. Now, at the end of the Nuremberg war trials, many sessions were devoted to sentencing underlings who only followed the orders of their superiors. Many of the men responsible for higher decisions had disappeared. Allied troops and commanders had little recognition of German aims and ideals during this period. They judged the Germans on the loss of life and suffering that they saw at the ending period. The war camps, prisoners. It's a period when food was scarce and life was cheap as a result. Now, over and over in the trials, people near the forced labor camps and factories admitted they were aware of the camps and the workers putting out production, but they were unaware of the inhumane conditions to a large degree. And those that did know what was going on didn't want to get involved or stick their necks out. The 6 million Jew figure used at Nuremberg ignored millions who migrated out of Germany between 1933 and 1945, and 2 million in Russia and out of the German territory. And since 90% of the Nuremberg trial legal staff were Jews or non-Americans, it's easy to see why most persons consider this court a mockery today. And there's little doubt that thousands of Jews died alongside other camp and factory workers, yet this was a tiny figure alongside the 2 million civilians who died in Allied air raids, and hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians killed by their own governments during this period. I should point out that Hitler wanted to conquer the world. Yet in the tons of documents and books, there's no mention ever made of this. Before Allied declarations of war, Hitler only took back what lands that belonged to Germany before World War I and were illegally expropriated during World War I. Well, hundreds of thousands of persons became homeless from the Nazi aggressions. But even much of this was distorted, and a perfect example was the diary of Anne Frank, which supposedly told of Otto Frank's condition, Anne's father, dying in a German concentration camp. Yet the original was subpoenaed in Switzerland and found to be a fake by forensic experts. Much of it was written by a ballpoint pen, which wasn't even available until after 1951. Should cover Nuremberg a little more completely. Many of the former German officers at Nuremberg got off with leniency if they supplied the statements desired by the prosecutors. Now, Bach-Zelowski, for example, testified that Himmler spoke about liquidating Eastern Europeans at the meeting. And Göring immediately denounced this as false. And the truth came out later in a later West German court hearing. It's estimated that thousands of false affidavits and hearsay documents were accepted as evidence at these infamous trials. And the simple truth was that most of the camps were industrial factories, which were producing war material. Efficiency was important, and most inmates weren't efficient if they were starved or died. Later in the war, food became scarce, as we pointed out, and disease ran rampant. Auschwitz, for example, produced fuel and rubber. 360,000 inmates were on the record for a 5-year war period. Yet propagandists put the figure of gassings alone at this one camp in the millions. Now, one of the Auschwitz camp supervisors testified at Nuremberg after being brainwashed and beaten by the communists before the trial. Many of the other witnesses who refused to testify to inhuman conditions were not allowed to testify or simply turned over to the Russians and disappeared. Now, as the Allied situation or saturation bombings paralyzed transport systems toward the war's end, starvation became too common to all Germany, and too many civilians as well as inmates died, and typhus epidemics then spread and accounted for the piles of human bodies that were found by Allied liberators, which you saw part of earlier here. Records show that there was little problem with food and medical supplies before this last frantic period. Well, what happened to the missing Nazis? Well, as we pointed out, many kept out of Russian hands by inventing stories that the Nuremberg trial crowd wanted to hear and put in print. and many others were set up by friends and acquaintances in other countries like Latin America. And since many Nazis were working as double agents for the U.S. Army toward the end of the war, there were men often set up in the United States. Bolshewing was an example who wound up with a computer instrument corporation in Silicon Valley, California. And as the November 1st San Jose Mercury article of 1981 supplied the details for this, supposedly he had powerful ties with other huge U.S. corporations. Well, he and other powerful Nazis in the United States are thought by some to be planning to take up a continuance of the Fourth Reich if they ever get the power again. The Wolf's Head Group, the original inner group of Germans who carried the idealistic aims of the Reich Forward, and the S&S and other branches were simply extension troops of these inner core idealists. And these elitists feel that they may lose World War II and World War III, but eventually, they will eventually bring about a world rule and a paradigm. Would kill them if they returned to Russia or the Soviets. So, the British Foreign Office and Anthony Eden were well aware of these people's death warrant when they drew up orders to force them back into Stalin's hands. Washington and Eisenhower were well aware of these facts when they voted to go along with the British policy. Many advisors were shocked and pointed out the consequences to come. The full-scale forced repatriation, though, came in late 1944. Many of the Russians and Cossacks aiding the Allies had been promised this life in Canada and Australia, and what they got was forcibly loaded in trucks and trains, and amid great bloodshed taken back to Russia by force. Well, there were 3 million that never even arrived. They were slaughtered in mass graves or sent to concentration camps in Siberia. And even when they got to Russia, eyewitnesses testified the least feeble were mowed down by machine guns, and the rest were worked like slaves until death claimed them years later. And other Russians were often sent back with new Allied clothing, and stripped of this clothing and sent to work camps in rags, according to Solzhenitsyn. And Tolstoy also wrote of the Zeks, or political convicts, who died by the millions. And compared to Hitler, were these good guys of World War II any better? In our search for truth here, we should look at another view of Hitler. One of Hitler's biographers tells us that Hitler was a member of a small mystical group who followed magical rites, and they believed that there was an ancient cultural center called Thule, which was inhabited by gods of great power, and they hoped to uncover the secrets of these ancients and bring about a new super race of gods. Well, persons close to Hitler say he was very concerned about bringing on a new race of genetic super beings through genetics, and was a medium to some extent. And he was supposedly linked to persons who were linked to secret societies and mystical organizations. He felt the Germans were the key to a higher race, and the closest race genetically to the ancient Atlantean and Thule supercultures. Well, High Scientific German is still a language unto itself and was supposedly used on Atlantis. It's even been occasionally heard during UFO monitoring. And this is not the everyday German that you hear in Germany. It is a scientific High German that only scientists usually know about. Now, some persons who've contacted the mystical Akashic records state Hitler's original purpose and mission on this planet was simply to upgrade our present technology. At a cycle's end, before a pole shift or major flood, humanity is supposedly given a chance to use either high-level technology to prevent the pole shift or to misuse and ignore the technology and lose these gains thousands of years. And Hitler then was a sole volunteer who came to upgrade technology and unconsciously gave his scientists free rein to develop atomic power, rocketry, and other technology we enjoy together today. And all thanks to Hitler, the bad boy. Well, since the internationalists often suppress technology that won't fill their coffers, such technology may never have come through in more conventional ways, according to the views of some of these mystics. Well, there have been a number of books written on the contact of Hitler with secret occult organizations and goals, as we pointed out, and a good example is The Morning of the Magicians. It claimed the Nazi elite had made pacts with various dark forces and masters, and yet few facts ever existed for these concepts. And Hitler even mentioned that men like Lance and his New Templar Golden Dawn aims were potentially ineffective. And the Germans were idealists, and especially Hitler. And Hitler came along and promised to give Germany back to the Germans. Salvation for believers. Now, since Jewish bankers and Catholics had bought up 80% of the country for pennies after World War I, hope and idealism was about all that the Germans had left. And writers dwell on the fact that Germans believed in the race and state as their god. Yet Marxists believe this also, and even Christian logic is the same. Kill them if they're not Christians is the theme that sent hundreds of thousands of humans to an early death. And the church called Hitler a heretic when he became unpopular, even though he remained a Catholic to the very end. Well, Joan of Arc was another example of heretics. While Hitler was supposed to be killing millions of Jews, the facts were that Jewish bankers were subsidizing his war factories, and he had a number of Jewish officers manning his country. Here we see some shots taken by Eva, his longtime companion in his little mountain hideaway. Shows you another side of Hitler, seldom seen in the propaganda movies. These are some of the few color movies that were ever made of Hitler. Eva was an amateur photographer herself. Well, Hitler was very clever and shrewd when it came to giving the people what they thought they wanted. He had a little higher education, but he read a great deal, and he relied on intuition and common sense as he rose to power. Later, he began to be close-minded and contemptuous of his advisors' opinions, and this was part of his downfall. His power madness had closed off his intuition and common sense. And there are those that even say there was a second Hitler that was substituted somewhere along in the war. He went mad, and this seems of his own life that we see here do not show what Hitler's true nature was, yet anyone who listened to Wagner and watched his diet carefully and wanted to impress his country and people should not be considered all bad. Dr. Morell, his physician, eventually had him taking dozens of drugs and was probably responsible more than anyone for turning him into a maniacal, miserable tyrant. And as his health grew worse, his self-control weakened, and his fits of rage and outbursts cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Well, while Hitler may have started with reasonably good intentions and lofty ideals, as he rose in power, it corrupted him in the same manner as so many others in history. He eventually had all of Germany hailing him, believing he was always right. And this is typical of men who fear competition and loss of their power. With Hitler and many of his staff with Jewish blood in their veins, he probably didn't promote the amount of Jewish persecution that he was credited with, as we pointed out, but allowed much anti-Semitism to exist for political expediency, and the German people saw that the Jews had gained a good part of Germany, and they became indignant at this and their cliquish nature. And after 1935, the Jewish situation deteriorated quickly, and Jewish property was confiscated, and many were sent to the work camps if they didn't have the money to get visas and leave Germany. These scenes are a memorial to the dead. Well, many writers have concocted stories of how Hitler hated religion and rejected its teachings, but the fact was he was a Catholic, and he stayed a Catholic, and as he became an egomaniac personality, he let his staff and Nazi leaders replace the usual German religions with a paganistic, mechanistic approach. Like all domination leaders, he tried to erase the usual human emotions enough to get act and react mechanistic followers that were better controlled. Well, to keep their coffers full, the persons who run the world's economies have always managed to keep conflict between nations alive and fired up. Today, the West has kept communism alive through constant technology, injections, and loans, which never get paid back. And this has never made much sense to most Americans. Yet, going back in history, you find the answer very simple. The Bolshevik Dominion leaders convinced the followers that force and control are necessary. And Hitler appealed to the citizens' nobler intellect and instincts of patriotism, devotion, and discipline, but at the same time held them tied to a fear of death and disobedience. And Hitler would have never retained his office if he'd lost his system's aura of legitimacy and legality and nationalism. As in all Dominion systems, there were no avenues for change by peaceful means. And the systems had to totally self-destruct under natural law. Now, the German anti-Semitism was fired by the same fuel that's always fanned resentment against the Jews. They controlled more of the wealth of the country than any other citizens. And even many of our own founding fathers feared the Jews and their legendary skill at manipulating the monetary systems. And actually, Hitler was 1/4 Jewish himself, according to several historians. Many of his staff were part Jewish. They're all Jewish. Newspaper accounts, records of the era show that the anti-Semitism scenario was greatly overdone. What atrocities that did take place, however, were carefully hidden from the German people by the Nazi leaders. Just as fanatical religious leaders shield their dominated followers from contrasting opinions and competitions, so too Dominion leaders like Hitler shielded their followers from truth and competition. Now, to show how easily Dominion can be repelled and beaten, we've only looked at Hitler's defeat. He started with ruthless exploits and bluff actions. Allied adversaries with conventional scruples and inhibitions put up little resistance at first. But once their fears and shock subsided, they called Hitler's bluff, and they quickly overpowered him. Well, Hitler's tactics in holding his officers to their ruthless system was another typical Dominion tactic. He paid his officers huge bonus money under the table so that they became bribed and caught up in his dishonesty and unmoral actions. And few persons can deny fame and power when it's offered, and even when a loss of ethics is involved. And Hitler had few talents and little humanity in his nature, yet he instinctively knew how to give people what they wanted to hear, and he used dominion techniques to hold power. He knew just how to use his voice to fan up the passions of an audience, and just how to brainwash them into following him. Criminals and dominion leaders have strong egos and lack of the ability to love, according to Freud and other observers in this field. And without affection, they have disgust for the whole world and themselves. They deny this in their words, but actions, you'll remember, always speak louder than words. Like all leaders, Hitler was only a pawn in the game of life himself, and he was a tool in the education of humanity. Millions of human beings have had a chance to learn from the events he created and that followed his course. And we'll learn about these a little later. And in a deeper mystical sense, the lessons all show the failure of domination actions, and they all point up the advantages of the free choice systems of our Creator. Now, the U.S. and our allies gained nothing but a few jobs from World War II, and the bankers and communists made billions and built empires. In 1956, the Hungarian freedom fighters died when our State Department told them to face the Russians without our aid, and MacArthur was later fired in Korea for fighting to win. It cost $30 billion to continue into Vietnam. Billions were loaned to the communists by taxpayers, which will never get paid back. And farms across our nation now go on the block for a few $100s owed. And do you think that anything has changed since Hitler's time? Well, not really. Generally speaking, the same international crowd control the banks yet and control the international policies of various countries through the banking manipulation. Now here we see some of the Nazi propaganda going out under Hitler's regime, the early Hitler regime. And this is important. Dictators must usually always control the media to some extent to get the popular approval. Here we see some of the gentlemen who were given power to the Atomic Energy Commission after the war. Roosevelt had taken it out of the hands of the military and put it into the hands of big business, private individuals who are seen here representing commissions under Roosevelt. And it's no wonder that most of our atomic secrets slowly leaked out. And during this period, if you'll remember, we had many persons who were speaking out against the communists. And these people were not popular at all. Well, in the past, leaders and persons who spoke out against the aims of all these powers and control were quickly silenced. And McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, who you remember, who was against communism, is a perfect example. And another one we tend to forget now is James Forrestal, who is another anti-communist who helped Greece and Turkey with aid after World War II. Or they'd have probably gone communist too. He gave them aid to keep them from falling into the communist hands. And he was vilified by the control press at the time. And what happened to him? Well, he fell out of a naval hospital window in a so-called accident, just as Patton had an accident earlier. Well, General Edwin Walker and General Brown and MacArthur and many other patriotic Americans are in about the same category. And other world leaders who had switched policies and decided to buck the internationalists had big problems fast. Here we see some of the communists that were found in the State Department, in our government, who were aided by lawyers and representatives who were backed by our government. Civil rights. We know what civil rights has turned into today. De Gaulle was another example of an international figure who several times got outraged at what was happening around him and spoke out against the red-controlled regimes and the internationalists. Well, the French economy was boycotted and foreign currency reserves drained immediately. And what happened in Asia during World War II was just as incredible. Japan was sending peace petitions to Moscow and the Red Cross in Geneva long before we dropped our atomic bombs on her. Roosevelt wanted Stalin in on the final ending, so we took control of the captured food and supplies that we'd taken from the Germans, they had in German warehouses, and we supplied 60 divisions for Stalin, while hundreds of thousands of Germans in the meanwhile subsisted at near starvation level. And the Soviets, who bore no burden in the Far Eastern War, were now allowed to strip China of everything of value that they wanted. 20 billion is the dollar's worth of the booty, according to the Chinese. Remember Stalin? Well, great guy. One of the heroes. And Mao, who we see here, then moved quickly as Chiang Kai-shek remained double-crossed, and Mao then looted Japan as they were looted. And Chiang Kai-shek was hamstrung by U.S. betrayal, and China fell to communism, and millions died because of this betrayal by Roosevelt. Well, Eisenhower was another good guy of the period. He became America's spokesman in World War II, and it was he who deliberately prevented his men like Patton from taking Berlin, preventing the loss of life, of freedom for millions, as Russia took over later. And it was good old Ike who later carried on the no-win policies in Korea that you should remember. And let the East German and Hungarians get abandoned in their uprising, and sanctioned Operation Keelhaul. Well, Operation Keelhaul, as we mentioned, handed back to Russia all the persons who'd fled and escaped the Russian Revolution and the anti-Soviet agents who'd aided the Allies during the war. And here we see some on a barge. They were shipped back on barges and trains. Hundreds of thousands, probably just as dangerous and traitorous to America's liberty was Ike's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. While posing as a Republican conservative, he spent 40 years scheming and organizing to bring socialism. And Roosevelt was the one that put him in power and kept him in power while Roosevelt was in office. And Dulles kept both political parties in our country powerless to bring in any new anti-socialistic politics. Several authors have written books showing Dulles was a brilliant strategist who planned and organized many years of actions against America's freedoms. One book was called The Actor because Dulles put on such a good act posing as a conservative Republican. He increased taxation and state control. And that's part of the legacy that he left us as a tool for the internationalists. And Senator McCarthy pointed out in his book America's Retreat from Victory that George Marshall was another traitor to America, who the press held up as a hero. And unlike MacArthur, 50 of his intelligence advisors told him at one time that to allow Russia into the Asian War would spell disaster and allow the communists to take over Asia. MacArthur knew better, but Marshall ignored this advice, and he also was the man most responsible for the sellout of Berlin after World War II, which we've previously covered here. One of the great patriots of all times was General MacArthur, and you can see what happened to him. He wanted to get us out of Korea with a win the war action, and he was dismissed. In 2 weeks he was dismissed. Well, Truman was not exactly a bad guy through his own intelligence, but according to many observers, he was used. Joseph McCarthy made a speech damning Marshall one time, and it was well documented and full of factual evidence, and yet it infuriated the press, made him more enemies than could handle, as history indicates. And like Hitler, bucked the system, McCarthy became the all-time evil bad guy. Well, throughout the history of mankind, we've had followers and mastermind devious users and manipulators. No system or government or tribal laws ever managed to last for long when such laws were brutal and depended on domination of humans. They last for a while, but as Rousseau's monumental Freedom and Dominion or Domination book pointed out, system after system of governments have arisen with the good of humanity as their starting point and foundation, and as each was slowly altered toward corruption and domination, each slowly self-destructed. History is a countless operation of dominion systems against each other and against free choice systems. And the persons that are ahead and looking down and controlling these systems are always making money off of each of these engagements and each of these conflicts. They're the ones that train the soldiers who are the dupes and allow themselves to get caught up. And this has happened from the dawn of history. And here we see one of the early American civilizations, the Mayas, that were no exceptions, because millions lived in South and Central America in very progressive choice cultures. And as the domination systems and priests gained control, each civilization self-destructed, and the Creator's natural laws simply wouldn't allow this human sacrifice and degrading systems to endure longer. Look in the history books, and you'll find the truth in between the propaganda. The Indians of our own area, North America, were constantly warring among each other. If you ever find the journals of the early explorers, they never could get along with one another. And so their systems self-destructed and were replaced by more ethical systems. And this was bloody, very bloody. It's always been bloody. One tribe which existed around the Missouri Plains had their members tortured and mutilated to reach manhood. And the great painter Catlin recorded some of the Mandan Indian tortures. 1840, smallpox decimated the entire tribe and put an end to this inhumanity. And here we see tribes going against each other with the captives. Captives were treated brutally in Indian cultures. Slaves. We have more documentation on this in other presentations. Karl Marx was the intellectual founder of communism, and his utopian paradise visions appeal to many persons caught up in the quagmire of domination systems. And they accepted him for the same reasons they accept the salvation promises of Christians, who rely on the coming kingdom of God. Well, socialism served the same outlook. Intellectuals could accept the new communist goals when disguised as socialism. And the goal was a classless, stateless kingdom of freedom. The only little catch to all this was that Marx and other Christian prophets pointed out that men would need to learn self-control and not dominate each other. Well, we should understand how communism took over in Russia so that we can see that the czars of the 1800s left and led the oppressive, corrupt systems, and eventually made the mistake of allowing the Jews to take over much of the economy of Russia. And the retail industries were over 80% Jewish, while the population was only 4% Jewish. And as they gained more power, Tsar Nicholas I replaced Alexander and started putting an end to the favoritism. He made the Jews serve in the army like everybody else, for one thing, and this infuriated them. And as the infamous May laws went into effect, the Jews, who owned much of Russia and their financial systems, retaliated. And the Rothschild banking cartels put the squeeze on the Russian treasury, and Trotsky, who you see here, slowly went into power. Millions of Russians found themselves in hard times, and the Jewish leaders and mastermind terrorists inflamed the out-of-work Russians and got them to riot against the government. Bloody Sunday in 1905 was blamed on Tsar Nicholas when he wasn't even in the city. Here you see a document from the Jewish Universal Encyclopedia, which points out that the majority of Jews were congregated in the cities, and that 37% of them belonged to the commercial class. And the Jewish persons dominated Russia in the urban centers in 1913. And only 15% of Russia's Gentile population lived in the cities, and many of these were freshly recruited from illiterate peasantry. Well, Bloody Sunday in 1905 was, as we say, blamed on Nicholas, and the people began to resent the Tsar, even though he later offered amnesty to the ringleaders in the uprising. And Trotsky and the other revolutionaries failed in their first uprising. Tsar Nicholas began to put land reform laws in and make things better for the Russian people. Stalin, who we see here, who headed up the reform, was shot by the Jews, who wanted no part of the new reform. They wanted the government. Well, as World War II wiped out the Tsar's regular army, the chance came. Russia had great food shortages. Factories had millions out of work. There was general chaos. So the Jewish leaders inflamed the majority of citizens, and anarchy occurred. And for some reason, completely unknown to most of the historians, the Tsar abdicated. And the communists took over. Here we see some scenes of that time. The Revolution, March 1917, in St. Petersburg. amazingly number of small persons, of people, when we consider that the fate of 150 million Russians was at stake. Mainly because of Jewish dissatisfaction and their determination to destroy the Tsarism. Well, it's the same old story all through history. Here we see the Cossacks dealing with their enemies. Hasn't changed a bit. War is always bloody. As we point out, the only little catch to communism was that Marx, the originator of communism, said that people had to learn self-control. We still haven't done this. The leaders who feel that private property is a source of inequality and inequality is squelched by church and state ownership have simply ignored the history of the world, which proves the opposite is true. The Crusaders who murdered, looted, and stole in the name of the church and their God was little different than today's communist leaders. Well, so now it's time, I suppose, for a little deeper view of World War II and the underlying causation factors that go deeper than the outer aspects. And we've just viewed a very negative scenario and seen how the majority of persons are only pawns in the larger play of power wielders. We've seen that for the majority of persons, the catastrophe in their lives, being in pain from the Second World War, was simply that they were born in what appeared to be the wrong place at the wrong time. But this is only outer appearance, however, and as we look deeper, we find the deeper truths. And as a background, to find the deeper understanding, we should go back to what's called the fall of man at the time of the Garden of Eden. As our species ate the so-called fruit of knowledge, we no longer dwelled in the innocence and perfection of an instinct base. At this time, the brain circuits were altered, and certain mind circuits were added to our new human species. Instead of acting on instinct alone like all the other animal species, we were cursed with the opportunity of choice. Well, instinct no longer guided our action, and everything we did had to center on a choice of action. Just like the judge, we had to make 1,000 little decisions every day. And unlike a cat, dog, or any other animal which knows instinctively what to do to survive, we humans were lost in a constant round of wondering which action to take, and what the outcome of our actions would be. And our new mind circuits kept our lives in constant chaos. And we were banished from the simple garden and so-called perfection. The ancient records, like the Hebrew accounts, told of the so-called fall of man. It occurred at the time that the fallen angels or gods got exiled to earth. And the book of Enoch is more explicit about all these watchers and their nature, but numerous ancient accounts all agree on several points. First, the fallen gods had relations with animal man, or the daughters of men, as the Bible terms it. And this act was what altered the brain circuits and contaminated our Homo sapiens species. And the Garden of Eden portrayed is only a simplistic version of much older and detailed versions, which came from ancient Sanskrit and Eastern records. And the second point of agreement is that The original exiled gods took on the bodies of men, and their non-material soul continued on from body to body. Well, this meant that there were always persons on Earth who had alien and superior data banks full of knowledge on how to manipulate other persons and technology. No animal ever grew power mad, built or used machines. Think about it. Only humans with new alien intelligence contamination ever did such things. And the persons then who were born with the soul of an alien were often ruthless. They were geniuses that could put together a kingdom or power structure at a very early age. Rockefeller. Most simply didn't carry over, though, a memory of their who they and where they were. Their soul knowledge originally came from. They only knew that the majority of persons acted like naive animals or sheep, and were very easily put to work and enslaved in their complex and ingenious domination systems. And since Animal Man, as we'll call him, was so rudely pulled out of this instinct perfection, certain holy works indicate that they could learn to control their new minds, and eventually they could gain the abilities that the ancient exiled gods once held. Jesus the Christ and many other great spiritual leaders showed what could be done once the negative mental aspects were transmuted and controlled by self-control. All of the details on how the domination systems act are found in the history books down through the past 10,000 years. And the details of how the Creator's choice system laws are set up are not so obvious, but the answer to this is very simple, because the dominion systems, or Satan as the Bible puts it, is in charge of this planet and its various governing systems. And look around if you don't believe it. The choice laws of the Creator center around the Golden Rule, or simply granting others the right to choose their own action. And the original gods or exiles got put here for trying to manipulate others and ignoring choice laws. And this is according to the ancient records. And what Earth now acts as is a training ground for contaminated humans. If we humans can learn that domination is a futile, dead-end system that only causes chaos and misery, we have a chance to graduate and have our paradise, which many of the spiritual leaders promised us if we could shape our act up here. War after war is added to our soul's data banks and our DNA knowledge. So inwardly, we eventually learn that hurt and war are painful, and we know better inwardly to choose them. And through enough of this pain, we hopefully learn compassion and to reject such dominion actions. And inwardly, we eventually know what's right and what's wrong or unethical. And continually we must choose. The rulers constantly tempt us with money, power, and glory. We may be at a loss outwardly, but inwardly we know what is right and wrong. And all we need to do is either use and abuse our fellow humans for such dominion rewards, or reject such temptation and grant others freedom. freedom of action and choice. The choice is continually ours. Wars are a game that create choice situations on a grand scale. Whole masses of humanity get to see firsthand what it feels like to be used and abused. And after thousands of years, a short time of peace and freedom, followed by dominion-fostered wars, humanity should be understanding the futility of war and destruction and domination. But such is usually not the case. Mothers and fathers still allow their states and taskmasters to send their children to wars. They support their states, no matter how corrupt and domination leaders may be. And after a state or government grows too oppressive, it automatically self-destructs. The civilizations that once were great lie in ruin. Well, you can see how this works by reading the great history books. The typical one that you should read is by Rousseau, the great German author, escaped Hitler. His monumental freedom and domination text showed how each oppressive system was doomed and how systems based on choice flourished until they were corrupted by the inaction and greed of their people. Rome and America both are very good examples of this, and today the U.S. freedoms are quickly disappearing, and if this continues, we too shall self-destruct. The law, which the Easterners call karma, brings retribution back on each action of domination that a person or country gives out deliberately. And this is an automatic law that's easy for anyone to observe. It's simple. One atom out of law in this universe would be a junk pile. And we humans who think we can force pain on others and break choice laws without tasting it back again ourselves are simply ignorant yet. Back to more experience in war, we must go to learn. Now, the proof of this is very easy, as we stated. Try to notice a country or a person who's practicing aggression and just see how fast they get it right back. Could be a pork chop hill in some Korea, or where it's captured and lost repeatedly, or it's just maybe an unethical cheating acquaintance who gets cheated right back by someone else within a few months. The action is there for you to see if you just look. And it's very simple and very effective. Well, to escape chaos and war, simply necessary to look at the systems you're caught up in, and the system you use in your daily life. If we so much as dirty a dish or cheat another person, we're acting in domination because we're forcing someone else to clean up our dishes or to make good our responsibilities. And if there are many persons like ourselves around, the systems that we're in will get corrupted and self-destruct. Think about it. If we become self-responsible, migrate to a place where there are others that are self-responsible, we'll be reasonably free of any chaos, as in the early country of the United States, where we had a constitution based on free choice. And since there are so few major groupings of such self-responsible people today, however, it's difficult. And the next best thing is to be self-responsible. Rely on our own inner soul knowledge to protect us. Because your soul is not a material assemblage. And it's not tied to any time or laws as we know it. and it can go to the future and determine what actions you take. It'll be beneficial or harmful, as the case may be, but only if you remain self-responsible and free of the need for more ethics lessons. And learning to know yourself and listen to your soul knowledge feedback is what the great spiritual leaders advocated. They advocated that it brought salvation. And this is a subject covered in other works that we produce. Flow line, we call it. Tapping into the soul flow line, which can bring amazing results and protect an individual from anything that can be directed against them. Well, the economies, which are balanced by choice and freedom, have long been more productive than those based on dominion and totalitarian states. And unfortunately, often these states are cranking out war material, but even then, they're productive. And when the old dominion domination controls are lifted, most domination power structures suppress new technologies, which threaten profits until these wars come along. And Hitler's development of rockets and wonder drugs, jet planes, was made possible in a few short years simply because he gave his scientists free rein to develop new ideas with none of the usual restrictions. And he accomplished more in 5 years than the previous 100 years before him in the field of technology. Amazing. We still owe Hitler credit for much of present civilization. The most feared man in history. And some spiritual visionaries feel that such technology was necessary at this particular time in history. They feel that humanity must have a choice and ability to neutralize the coming pole shift and the natural planetary upheavals to come. And this technology is going to be the key. And here are some books that cover this subject. The phaser weapons that we have today will be able to dematerialize vast areas of the Antarctic ice which now threaten to unbalance the polar axis and create a devastating shift or flood. And many of these writers feel that Hitler himself is only a pawn in the higher scheme of things. And as fanciful as this may sound right now, we may give it some more serious thought as our axis continues shifting further out of balance, allowing the Gulf streams to shift and the devastating weather changes to occur. What you see here is the Pole Watchers newsletter, which is one of the newsletters which came out during the 80s. And there were many other publications and books on the subject which almost never got public acceptance. Hugh Brown's Cataclysms of the Earth came out in the late 70s and was very difficult to obtain in the 80s, out of print. But John White put out his Pole Shift book, which was a brilliant look at the subject from many views, from many authors' views. And it was available in the early 80s and mid-80s. Velikovsky came out in 1950 with Worlds in Collision. And oddly enough, this was a bestseller. But it showed that there was a planet which caused the floods, which was incorrect. But it was a great source of documentation as to the floods prior to the present. And there were many scientists who brought out their own small publications, like Emil Sepik here, The Imminent Shift of the Earth's Axis, which gave the author's opinions as to what caused the pole shift and when it was due. And many felt that in about 2004 it was due. And again, the soul's knowledge of this was an individual's protection, and those who could tap in would be free to be in the right areas at the right time and to escape. And to escape destruction and chaos through self-knowledge. And at this point, let's look into some of the forces and temptations that we constantly confront. And as World War I provided huge profits for the internationalists and the munition makers, they slowly perfected methods of manipulation. Profits were enormous. Morgan banking cartels in the U.S. made to $30 million just acting as a buying agent between deals. Besides the U.S. steel firms like Bethlehem, the DuPont and other industries made huge profits in the war. But the European cartels made our own seem small by comparison. Before World War II, Vickers Armstrong of England and Schneider of France, Krupp of Germany, and Skoda of Czechoslovakia had a virtual monopoly on the munitions for the rest of the world. And they learned how to flare up fear in one country and play it against another nation in arms sales. America's steel corporations, for example, broke up disarmament conferences prior to the war, and Krupp and Skoda contributed fortunes to back Hitler and his policies. And others owned newspapers to spread war scares and help build up armaments. And Sir Basil Zakharov, whom you see here, represented some of the elite and was a master at this manipulating. He could manipulate one country against another, repeatedly did so, and in World War I, he'd sell submarines to one nation, and leak the information so another frightened nation would buy them also. Today, of course, the game hasn't changed one little bit. We can all remember Korea, which provided billions for the profiteers. And they found that the communist versus the West scenario could sell billions in new, complex war materials. And to keep down production costs and to raise profits even further, the internationalists found ways in recent years to erode away union wage protection and even put our women to work in the West. During World War II, for example, the industrialists noted that women could work in factories and would do it for less wages. So, you can guess what happened. Here are women coming from one of the munition plants during World War II, courtesy of Winchester. What the internationalists and industrialists did, of course, was to encourage cheap imports and send their factories overseas so that the workers of the world would have a more even work unit value, and America's wages would slowly fall, and our advantages and freedoms would fall likewise. Well, during World War II, one of the cleverest manipulation games of all time was Lend-Lease. And as you recall, the British evacuated Dunkirk, leaving behind most of the equipment they had, and things looked bleak for the British. And America's industrialists, who backed Roosevelt and Secretary Hull, realized that Britain had spent most of her reserves, and there were laws passed by Congress preventing us loaning her more money. Well, they dug up an old law that allowed us to lease war goods, and they developed our Lend-Lease program. Well, the international financiers were elated. $7 billion in supplies were shipped to England in 3 years. And $4 billion in supplies like planes, tanks, and trucks were also shipped to Russia. Millions of tons of steel and raw material followed. 44 other countries also received millions in this gigantic giveaway program. A lend-loss, it was called by many persons at the time. But Roosevelt and the elite had Americans sold on the idea, and the internationalists found out how just easy it was to manipulate nations on a large scale. Roosevelt's scheming and maneuvering to bring the U.S. into the war has been touched on previously here, but to detail the facts further, we should recall how things were in the years just prior to World War II. Americans were isolationists who wanted no involvement with the chaotic civilizations around them for the most part, and Roosevelt appealed to this attitude and promised us peace and continuity. And then he gained office. And once in office, he realized most of us didn't want responsibility and would never commit ourselves to the money-making wars of the internationalists who backed him, without some sort of drastic national emergency. Well, FDR tried for several years then to draw us into war with Germany, without success. And then he hit upon the idea that we could be drawn in legally through the Axis agreement between Germany, Italy, and Japan. If Japan could be drawn into the war, he knew we could get involved legally, and the internationalists could make billions. And Japan, being dependent on raw materials from outside sources, was no great threat to the internationalists, and could be goaded, they hoped, into action because she was at war with China. And once her raw materials were cut off, she had to either fight or perish. Roosevelt blockaded Japan then and froze all her assets in the United States. And here you see a picture of Japanese Americans who had their assets frozen, and many of them never received these assets back. And then, in conjunction with Churchill and other internationalist leaders, FDR started a squeeze on Japan in many, many ways. Roosevelt worked out many of these crafty details with Churchill in August of 1941 in a secret Argentia meeting. Shortly after this, Roosevelt gave Japanese Ambassador Nomura a severe tongue lashing and an ultimatum. The results weren't long in coming, with Roosevelt's attack through blockades and repeated verbal abuse. The Pearl Harbor attack was simply a desired retaliation by the Japanese. A number of sources have documented the fact that Roosevelt was well warned of the impending attack at Pearl Harbor, but wanted the public emotionally shocked into supporting his war effort with no qualms or hesitation. The infamous Merle Smith cablegram is typical of such warning Roosevelt received, and when the Japanese passed the 100-degree east, 10-degree north point, the Dutch became concerned and sent cablegrams to both Manila and General Short in Hawaii. The message of the Japanese advance was relayed to Washington, and the rest is history. And persons wishing proof of Roosevelt's deceit at Pearl Harbor can gain any number of documented facts from several books which came out on the subject in the 70s and 80s. And the final story of Pearl Harbor by Harry Barnes is typical. He showed that General George Marshall conveniently disappeared until he sent a Western cablegram warning of the attack, which was obviously delivered too late. And he found several messages of the incoming fleet had been intercepted, decoded, and suppressed by the Allies and FDR's regime. Several anti-war patriots and soldiers who stumbled on what had actually transpired were silenced during these war years. Hamilton Fish who was ranking Republican in the House Foreign Affairs Committee at the time, said Roosevelt repeatedly attacked German ships and submarines prior to Pearl Harbor, and told a great deal different story than the press gave us at the time. Fish said that FDR lied to the public and told us the SS Kearney and Greer had been fired on first. Well, this was nonsense, because Hitler actually had ordered his navy to avoid American vessels and only defend themselves as a last course of action. FDR then ignored our constitutional procedures and acted the part of a dictator, calling on infamous emergency legislation to override our constitutional laws. And then, after the war, he gave away millions and millions of dollars worth of ships like these, waiting to be given away. Well, as we pointed out before, the Allied press constantly fanned hate propaganda against the Germans and the Japanese. They were continually depicted as inhuman monsters who committed unspeakable cruelties against civilians and prisoners. And to find the truth of the matter is very simple, however. European newspapers of the time show that the Jew hatred scenario was ridiculous, and the Germans were, generally speaking, gentlemen to the end. As an example, not one case of rape ever came to light in the famous Nuremberg trials. And on the other hand, historians will generally acknowledge that somewhere around 100,000 women were raped and abused in Vienna alone when the Russians, our allies, arrived there. There were thousands of children and women that were killed and committed suicide under the brutal hands of our Russian allies, and nowhere in the annals of history did such a mass rape of a captured people ever come to light before. It's estimated that at least 2 million women were put to work like slaves and concubines and violated and used during this period. And yet Americans heard nothing of this, and were on the other hand told of the inhuman Germans and their brutality. Well, documents prove that Germans could be executed for such violations to women under their regime and Hitler. Yet, our Jewish propaganda movies still crank out lies about what actually transpired then. And when television came along, even television cranked out the same scenario about how bad the Germans were. And Westerners never seemed to give second thought as to why millions of Russians and Eastern Europeans retreated with Hitler's defeated armies when they came back from Germany. The censors of the time dared not show the true problem. We can't seem to understand that Hitler's army was actually the liberating army for much of Europe. Little did people of the period know that most of the equipment used by the brutal Reds at the time had been produced in factories that they ran and had our USA stamp on it. And from the first, America had never really wanted dealings with Russian communism, but simply couldn't stand up, evidently, against Roosevelt's propaganda and tactics. And just who is backing the brutal Soviets should be a question that more Westerners should ask. It isn't that difficult to find the truth. Shortly after World War II, we didn't send our equipment directly to the Reds. Our internationalists simply built them factories so they could build their own war equipment. And of course today things are a little more sophisticated, and we worked little roundabout deals continually. And to supply these factories of Russia, we turned over all of the raw materials and wealth of Eastern Europe, and after Japan surrendered, we gave Stalin all of Manchuria, which was the industrial center of China, plus all of Japan's arms and supplies, which we left there. So what was back of all this betrayal and scheming by the persons to hold the purse strings of the world? Well, we know that many of the heads and leaders of the world's religions and governments and secret orders schemed together. Morgenthau, who was FDR's right-hand man, was a typical example. And here he's proposing the heaviest taxations against the United States that ever been known in the world's history. The Knights of Malta and other secret elite underground powers backed Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and Hitler in Germany, hoping that the rich Mother Russia would be captured and fall to the elite. When the Jews kept Russia, the plans shifted, of course. High-level Nazi leaders and hundreds of top German aerospace experts were given top positions in the new military-industrial complex in the U.S. and other Western countries. It then became a high-stakes game between several competing international elitist powers. And the goal was to rule humanity and subject all earthlings to the benevolent rulers who came out the victor in this little game. A paradise with a ruler running it was the goal, and the problem, of course, come on when you figure out just who these leaders will be. This domination game never seems to end, and there are very few citizens of the world who are standing up. Very few vented their displeasure before World War II, and very few are standing up to the system today in the wars that are almost due. And we citizens, of course, are apprehensive about all this, but very few of us ever take any actions, true actions. And as this production is completed in the mid-'80s, the military-industrial complex has us pointed toward a final battle for humanity and her freedom. And America's lost virtually 80% of our constitutional freedoms, and most of us aren't even aware of it. It's the same old story, and as we're slowly brought into greater control, there are now several scenarios open to us. First, it may happen that the internationalists just can't balance things enough to where they can sell all their war materials to each country without having the situation explode on them and get out of hand. So we might have an accidental war that'll destroy us all. Secondly, we could have a one-world system with one of the elite's favored rulers forcing out all competition. And third, as unlikely as it may seem, we could have humanity rising up against the dominion systems here to face them and face their responsibilities and create the paradise based on choice and the golden rule that all the spiritual teachers said we could have if we made it. And finally, we could continue with a mixture of these systems and allow the coming pole shift, which we mentioned earlier, to remain incorrected. We could allow Mother Nature to wash us all off the face of the earth for another fresh start later. And if not enough of us care enough to get involved, then I think we all know what the outcome will be. And as the weather becomes more erratic in the 90s, and the freedoms disappear and gassings, later historians tracked down the truth. They found that the 6 million figure was false and dreamed up by organized groups interested in gaining worldwide sympathy. What did occur at this time in history was a number of little-known episodes that put the Jewish Holocaust concept to shame. In the Allied raid against the disarmed open city of Dresden, there were hundreds of thousands of civilians that died just before the war ended. Now, high-level military men are still ashamed of this unprecedented act. Well, later, we, the British and Americans, turned all of the Polish and other resistance fighters back to Russia to be slaughtered and sent to Soviet prison camps. And here you see just a few of these camps. These are the gulags, where millions of workers and political dissidents, men, women, and children, have been executed without trial, and enslaved in work battalions, starved and beaten. And the only crime is usually their religious, social, or political beliefs, their desire for individual and national freedom. These places mark the graveyards of millions of souls who dared to defy the system which now enslaves hundreds of millions of people, and who our press very seldom mentions. And here's another example of injustice that our press never covered. Chicago, Monday, February 25th, 1935, Chicago American, which was a small independent newspaper in America, covered this story, and it was the only one that historians feel ever covered it. 6 million perished in Russia. The Ukrainians died from a Soviet-planned famine, and this came about because the Ukrainian farmers put up massive resistance to Soviet plans to seize their land and turn it all into cooperatives. All the food found was taken, and by the 1930s, tens of thousands were dying weekly. And the rest of Russia had plenty of food, and these photos were smuggled out of Russia by a Chicago reporter, Thomas Walker. And to this day, no media broadcast has ever told this shocking story of the true Holocaust of the century. Now, this famine was among the worst recorded in history. The Encyclopedia Britannica in '68 claimed that it took the lives of 7 million Ukrainians, but it's scarcely acknowledged today in the West. Moscow never even officially admitted this famine ever existed. It was the result of Moscow's national and socio-economic Ukrainians in particular. And here's a map of the USSR concentration camps and psychiatric prisons today in 1985. And the press very seldom ever mentions it. Anything about it. Roosevelt was very aware that the war would bring prosperity to the U.S., and he cooperated in every way with the European elite, or the internationalists, the bankers. And the West could have invaded Germany in 1942, but Churchill kept stalling for 2 years to ensure that the industrialists had greater profits. By 1943, the German generals knew that the war was lost, and they made repeated efforts to end the war on any honorable terms that they could. Now, they promised to keep the Soviets out of the Western Europe, and all of their efforts were perverted, discounted, and ignored. And Hitler had been right in claiming that the West wanted the Soviets in power in the total destruction of his Germany. National Socialism was not the issue at all, regardless of press. Billions of dollars poured into financing the Allied armies and rebuilding Europe after the war. And the profit went into the coffers of the elite internationalists, was financed by taxpayers of the West. And facing sure death at the hands of Soviets or giving a story to the British about what they wanted to hear, the most of the Germans chose the latter. The generals told how evil Hitler and the Germans were bad and how brilliantly the Allies had fought, and only British translators were used in the Nuremberg trials. And if the story didn't fit what they wanted to hear, it never got in the books. And the Germans said that Italians and Negro troops were just worthless. And what they said was Eisenhower's abilities were mediocre, and the Soviet moral brutes, and the British bumblers, and the only man that they had anything good to say about was Patton. And they said he was great. And of course, none of this ever got in print. These are interviews, the Nuremberg trial. The interviewers, who later wanted the record set straight, were often sick of the twisting of the facts by the Allied commanders at the time. And German officers that wouldn't cooperate and stretch the truth as they wished were often just turned over to the Russians, and they were never heard from again. And this was quite an incentive to get the story they wanted out of the German staff. Some half a dozen German attempts to surrender have been pieced together by truth gatherers over the years. And one example was Pennsylvania's Governor George Earle, who was in the war under FDR as an attaché. And he was contacted by German officers and tried many times to get instructions on what to do from there on from FDR. And for his persistence, he got sent to a remote South Pacific and total silence from FDR. This is old Blood and Guts. Several months before his death, Hello, this is History You Never Heard, Part 1. And the following presentation has been collected together to fill in the gaps concerning what actually transpired in recent history. In a work of this nature, it's virtually impossible to list the many references and sources for our material without wasting too much precious viewing time. So, most documentation is easily available for persons who will make a little commitment toward truth. Well, few governments or leaders have ever been objective or allowed true history placed on the records. And what you see here is a mixture of official war films, propaganda, and unofficial counter-observations. And the truth you'll need to sort out for yourself. This material can be duplicated and distributed in the interest of educating your fellow human beings, too. Freedom comes through knowledge and action. And you can either view this and do nothing or act to further this knowledge. Well, to pinpoint the bad guys and the so-called good guys over the past is very difficult unless you just ignore what's written and go strictly on action. And this test is usually very revealing because the favorite roles are often reversed under this criteria or test. Today, for example, we never let up on the terrible Hitler. We constantly play diplomatic games with the communists, even though then we can easily see that more than 150 million persons have been recently murdered in the name of communism. China's Mao admitted to killing 63 million Chinese peasants alone, and yet today our leaders eagerly embrace new relationships with the same old brutal systems. At the end of World War II, the Red Cross reported that around 271,000 persons had died in German work camps from disease and old age and executions. Now, this was nowhere near the 7 million claimed by the communist Jews from New York City a little later. True, there was a terrible death rate, but even Germans were dying from malnutrition toward the ends of the war. and after their food supplies were cut off by Allied bombings and war shortages in general. And here we see many of the troop trains were diverted to carrying the prisoners and workers to the work camps. Records indicate that the Allies did not bomb Auschwitz because they wanted the advanced synthetic rubber plant intact. Later, many witnesses and records at the time confirmed there were none of the gas chambers that later were supposed to claim 10,000. Germans were used as slave laborers in England, France, and many Western European countries. And it wasn't until Harry Truman came along and freed them that they were let go and returned to Germany. And this is something you'll never hear. And Churchill also wanted blood, and he wanted to use deadly anthrax gas in one situation against Germany, and he would have murdered millions of civilians if he'd had his way, according to the Lundy Sunday Times investigation at the time. He and Roosevelt did manage to exterminate hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in their infamous fire bombings. When surrender was only weeks away, the fire bombing of Dresden in 1945 mutilated and killed 250,000 civilians for no other apparent reason than by Russian standards very early. Fortune magazine brought out this fact in the 80s. Many non-Khazar Jews are encouraged to leave Russia and are politically unpopular. And Solzhenitsyn, the Russian expose writer, mentions that Jews who run the Russian prison camps and are not among the inmates. Today, at least 80% of the Russian leaders are Jews, and this is easy to document. It's only the Khazar Jews that have pushed for world domination and have been caught up in the ruthless dominion tactics, though. Where the genetic lineage came from is another and longer tale. The Soviets have long had more patience than most Westerners, and have spent years slowly gobbling up the world by patient craftiness and double-dealing. Peaceful coexistence, to them, simply means that they can keep on conquering country after country by internal revolution and subversion without the international large-scale wars that they saw before. The Afghans and Central America youths, for example, are sent to Cuba or Russia for indoctrination and are later let loose on their own people to bring on communism from within. Well, as the Allies came to the various work camps at the end of the war, what they found was pretty appalling to them. They'd not suffered food shortages nor been fed inadequate rations for months. The anthrax and typhus epidemics had killed thousands in some camps. This brought on the Holocaust charges. And to substantiate these charges from eyewitnesses was difficult at the time, since few prisoners would substantiate this idea of a purposeful starvation and cruelty. And a couple of Americans who we'll see here were in these camps and are explaining here how the rations were very skimpy, but they were hardly starved and tortured.
In 2 hours, we received very little food. 2 bowls, a very watery soup, and a small bread ration a day. Some of the men were not able to do this type of work on the food they were receiving, and upon not being able to, they were hit with rifle butts by the guard. I myself, at one time, because I was not able to do the work, was hit with a brick thrown by one of the guards.
F. Patton's compromising stand on the denazification of the Bavarian Zone, which his troops occupied, cost him the commandership to the Third Army. Well, he was put into a paper army. He was known as the toughest as well as one of the most profane officers in the American forces. He maintained strictest discipline, and the Germans thought he was the most brilliant strategist and general that we had. He was a good strategist and a patriotic soldier. He realized that if he held Prague, he would hold the key to European defense. And just before he arrived in Prague, the shocked Roosevelt and staff manipulators told him to stop at once and hand over this territory to the Russians, wouldn't they? Well, the Czechs in Prague pleaded. They wanted the West to let Patton liberate them. But evidently the powers influencing the war's policy wanted the Russians to gain control of this area. Patton was not happy about these and later events at all. And then a mysterious car crash later ended his life, and the events surrounding this accident, so-called, and the death certificate's validity are still questionable. Well, Patton ran wild when he finally landed in Europe. He quickly bottled up several 100,000 German troops. And is this why they firebombed Dresden, Germany, and killed millions of innocent civilian Christians, and allowed the communists to gobble up much of Europe? Well, we shall never know. We do know that both the Communist Revolution and Hitler's Nazis were financed and aided by various American English bankers who backed Roosevelt and Churchill later when Hitler wouldn't cooperate and couldn't be kept in control. Well, unlike the villain Hitler, Franklin Roosevelt did not follow through on his political promises. Hitler gave Germany prosperity, and he gave it back to the Germans just as he'd promised, and Roosevelt told us he'd drive the money changers from the temple, and he'd keep our boys out of any more wars, and reduce bureaucracy. And on every count, he did just the opposite of what he promised. Well, the bankers manipulated several panics to pave the way for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and Roosevelt completed this destruction of our dollar when he confiscated the gold backing and gave it to the private Federal Reserve bankers without so much as a receipt. Now, Henry Morgenthau was the Secretary of the Treasury during FDR's terms. In September of 1944, he outlined a plan to totally destroy Germany, make virtual slaves of her war survivors. Well, because of Morgenthau, for 3 years, hundreds of thousands of Germans